Welcome, everyone. My name is Paige Rivard. I'm the CEO for PWSA and mom to Jake, age 12, living with PWS. I feel like I've said that a lot lately for those of you who are joining us again. And several of you have been on for our previous 3 presentations. But again, we're so excited to be offering this first ever Behavior Summit. I think we've had a great day. And so welcome back, everybody who was with us, and welcome if this is your first session. Previously, we had Stacy Ward, Director of Family Support. She talked about the ABCs of behavior. And then we listened to Patrice Carroll, who shared with us challenging behaviors, prevention is key. And then we heard from Casey Bedard on understanding tantrum behavior in PWS, why it happens and what to do about it. As a reminder to everybody, this summit is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel, as well as hosted on our website. And also a link will be sent to everyone who registered. So you will be able to access all of this great content from today. And it's hard to believe we're wrapping up our first Behavior Summit. It feels like the day went by very fast. And I know everybody has received a lot of great tips and education. We've been receiving a lot of emails and texts saying how much people appreciated this summit. So I'm sure we'll be doing more of these to come this year. And for our last presentation, I'm so happy to introduce to you Cindy Szapacs, who will be sharing information on functional behavioral analysis in the school setting. So a great topic, and one of those topics that you could probably have a couple hours session on, but she's going to give us the brief overview. And Cindy is a board certified behavior analyst who has a master's degree in education. She's been working in the field of special education, mostly using applied behavior analysis for many of those years. She's worked both as a direct service provider to individuals with a variety of diagnoses between age 1 and 21, as well as a consultant providing individual, small group, and large group trainings to families and professionals. Currently, Cindy works as a behavioral analyst supporting classrooms. She's also the mother of 2 boys, one whom has PWS. And Cindy, thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing your expertise and presenting for us. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Paige. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this topic. I know it comes up a lot. So like Paige said, we're going to talk about functional behavior assessments in the school setting. So I know some of you may have participated in Stacy Ward's presentation earlier on the ABCs of behavior, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, the same page when we talk about behavior. So I'm going to go through it briefly. It's not an intensive look at the ABCs of behavior, but we're going to just kind of touch on that so we're all on the same page. So Paige, if you can read in the chat box for me, if I say the word behavior to you, you hear the word behavior, what's the first thing that comes up in your mind? Go ahead and type out, what does behavior mean to you? What do you think of when you hear behavior? And if you could tell me some of those, Paige.
And actually, it's in the Q&A section. The chat is disabled. So if you could do that in the Q&A box, that would be great.
Okay, and I can see that. Behavior is communication. I like that. Okay, nice. Anyone else have something they think about when they hear the word behavior? Is it usually a good connotation, a bad connotation? Way of expressing yourself, it's evolving and changing. Okay. These are good. Response to something someone doesn't want to do, normally a bad context. Actions or words to express. All right, good. Thanks for sharing. Those are all really good. Someone else says something you do usually. Yep, somebody's had some training in behavior analysis or there. Anything someone does that is observable and measurable. Yep, that's true. Those are all great. Thank you so much for sharing those. And I'm actually surprised I only got one comment about, something in kind of a negative context, because oftentimes when in the line of work I do, when people come to me and they say a student's having a behavior, it's pretty much always viewed negatively. But behavior isn't necessarily something that's negative. So something that's negative. So as somebody had said earlier, when we talk about behavior, behavior is observable and it's measurable. So the term behavior is neutral. So the word behavior doesn't equal a maladaptive behavior. It doesn't mean screaming, crying, throwing. It's just a neutral thing that anybody does, right? It's something somebody does. And what that person does, how it affects the environment, how it affects others, how it affects that person themselves, helps us determine if it's a behavior that we would want to continue that person doing, or we'd want to change it or stop it in some way. So when we talk about behavior, we want to be able to see it. You've got to see it. You've also got to be able to measure it. And measuring can happen in different ways. Maybe you count them, maybe you time it, maybe you see how long it takes for the behavior to start. You can even measure pitch or volume of sound. So when we talk about behavior, it's something that a person does. So they engage in a behavior. A person is not the behavior. So, throwing, hitting, kicking, if it's a negative behavior, if they're talking, if they're asking for things that they want, if they're waiting patiently, it's something they're doing and it's separate from who they are. So the nice way of thinking like this is that it allows us to look at behavior objectively. And for those of us that are parents, this can help take a little bit of the emotionality out of how am I supposed to respond to this behavior? Because we just observe it, we just measure it. It is what it is. It's what the person's doing. It's not who the person is. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. We have our ABCs. The A is the antecedent, which is what happens immediately before a behavior occurs. It also signals to that person that reinforcement is available. So if an instructor says, hey, sit here at this table, and then when the student sits, which is the behavior, and then the consequence ends up being something that they want, over time, that individual knows, oh, when somebody says sit, that signals to me that something good might come. So I'm going to sit so that something good can come. So in the consequence section, which is what occurs immediately after the behavior. So the antecedent is immediately before, literally almost connected to the behavior, not 5 hours before, not the day before, right then. And it's something, you can see in the environment that happens. And then the consequence is something else we can see in the environment that happens. And it occurs immediately after the behavior. Consequences are most effective when they're right after the behavior. Again, immediately, not 5 minutes later, not an hour later, not the next day at school. That's not going to be as effective. So the consequence is immediate. And you might talk about, and when we talk about consequence, again, it is something that is neutral. This doesn't mean punishment. It just means it happened after the behavior. And if the behavior increases, then you've used positive reinforcement. If you've given something and the behavior increases, we've used positive reinforcement. If the behavior decreases because of that consequence, that's when we talk about what punishment is. So in the lights of applied behavioral analysis, reinforcement refers to a behavior that increases, and then a punishing consequence is something that decreases a behavior. So this is our standard kind of 3-term contingency, the ABCs, which are talked about a lot. Now I'm going to add in a 4th one here, and it's not me adding it. This is something as a field we're looking at paying a lot more attention to. A motivating operation. Some people may have heard setting event, very similar. Motivating operations just used a little bit more frequently now. So motivating operation is part of the antecedent condition, but it can occur. May not be immediately before the behavior. It's something that temporarily alters the value of the reinforcer. And then by altering the value of the reinforcer or the consequence, we can make a behavior more or less likely to occur. So for example, it's possible that, in the morning, that your child got up at 2 a.m. and has been up all morning. So you tell the teacher, hey, they've been up at 2 a.m. That's a motivating operation. That's a setting event. That is something that is going to alter the value of sleep later on in the day. They're going to want to sleep. Sleep's going to be more valuable at noon than it would have been on a day where they had a lot of sleep. So they're going to be more motivated to engage in certain behavior to try to get sleep or to try to get out of doing work because they want to rest. So even though a child didn't sleep the night before, then they go to school and they seem okay. And then the teacher says, here, we're going to go to gym class now and we're going to run around the gym. And then they start to engage in problem behavior. They say no and they run away. So the antecedent was the transition told to go run. But because they were tired, they were more likely to engage in that running away, that elopement behavior. And when we're talking, and this is going to come up a little bit later in my talk, but when we talk about Prader-Willi syndrome, and when you're looking at a functional behavior assessment and you're looking at changing behavior, these motivating operations are huge. They have such a strong effect on behavior in those with Prader-Willi syndrome. So that was just a quick little snippet there, so we're all on the same page. So now we're going to talk about what is a functional behavior assessment. So pretty straightforward. It's a process. It aims at figuring out why a person engages in a specific problem behavior by analyzing the environmental variables. So when should an FBA be conducted? So there's a variety of different reasons. We're going to talk about some of the practical reasons, and we're also going to talk a bit about the law. Now, as we talk about the law in regards to functional behavior assessments and IDEA in general, there's federal law and then there's state law. So I'm not going to be giving you guys like some of the specific laws as far as timelines or ways to do things. You're going to need to access your state law for that. And I have a link later on that, that we can share that you can use to get more of that information. Because I live in Pennsylvania, so I know all the timelines for Pennsylvania and the process, but it could be a little different in other states. So practically speaking, when should an FBA be conducted? So anytime there's a behavior that interferes with learning. So sometimes you may have, a student who's not, making progress. They're not, when we look at their rate of learning, they're not acquiring skills they should be acquiring. We've made changes to teaching procedures. It's still not happening. What's going on? Why aren't they learning? Or their engagement in some sort of problem behavior, say, elopement, running away when you're not supposed to. They're spending so much time running out of the classroom, running out of the building, running around the classroom that they're not able to sit and learn. So that running around is interfering with their learning. So that's when you would consider doing a functional behavior assessment. If standard positive behavior interventions have been unsuccessful. So a lot of times, depending on where your student is, if you have a student that's participating in a classroom that has a lot of special ed students, so like a self-contained special ed classroom, those classrooms often have standard procedures that they use to, positive reinforcement strategies in the classrooms, standard ways to respond to problem behavior. And those have been implemented. Or within the, in the gen ed classroom, the standard things that are going in there, a lot of the classrooms, a lot of schools have positive behavior support plans, the general PBIS. So you've been doing that and it's not working. They're still engaging in this problem behavior. This individual needs something more. They need something different. Let's look at an FBA. A telltale sign is when you're getting a lot of calls from school and your child's engaging in all this problem behavior and the school staff are saying, I don't know. I don't know why he's doing it. I don't know why she's doing it. We're changing all of these things. We really don't, we don't know what's going on. When they say, I don't know, that is a huge reason to say, well, then we need to do a functional behavior assessment. Because what does a functional behavior assessment do? It figures out why. When we don't know why, we need to do a functional behavior assessment. And this is all under the auspices that your child does not yet have. An FBA has not been done on this behavior, and they don't have a positive behavior support plan, because we'll talk a little bit about how that could be a little different. So we're talking about a child who does not have any formal testing yet done on behavior. So I don't know why they're doing it. Ding, 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 red flag. Let's do an FBA because it's going to tell us why. And if you're considering a change in educational placement, it's really best practice to do an FBA. So what that change in educational placement means is possibly moving to a more restrictive environment. And that could even be within the school setting. Maybe your child participates in, a general education class for 100% of the time or 80% of the time, and we're thinking, oh, there's all this problem behavior, they can't participate, with their other peers, so they need to be in a more contained setting. You just want to rule out that all the possible changes that could be done in that lesson, in that more inclusive setting, have been done. So if you're 100% on board, yes, we need to make this change, then go ahead and make the change. But you could do an FBA if you're considering a change in educational placement, because there could be some findings that come up that keep that individual in that less restrictive setting, which is always nice to do. But the bottom line is, anytime there's a behavior interfering with learning, and that can also be interfering with the learning of other students in the environment. It could be such that even though your child's engaging in problem behavior, they're still meeting their IEP goals, they're still making progress, but the other students in the room aren't able to access their learning environment because of what this other child is doing. So that's another factor as well. So now, according to the law, so what the law says, legally speaking, when are you supposed to do an FBA? So again, if the student doesn't already have one done, so you don't have an FBA done, and the student has a disability, possibly they've been suspended, there's been a manifestation hearing, somebody's determined that this problem behavior is a manifestation of the disability. Because this individual has this disability, that's why they're engaging in this problem behavior. You need to do an FBA because you need to figure out how to support that person. What supports do they need? What skills do they need to learn given their disability? Anytime a student's referred to law enforcement, so if the cops are called because of problem behavior and there's no FBA behavior plan in place, that should be done. Again, when the behavior interferes with the learning environment, when the student is removed from the school placement for 10 or more school days. So that doesn't have to be 10 days in a row. So typically you're being removed from school a lot. The one thing to think about, if you are being called to pick up your child because of problem behavior, that is a suspension. Hi, your kid's destroying the classroom. Can you come get him? It's better for everyone else. Or if they're saying you need to come get him, that should be recorded as a suspension because you're removing them because of their problem behavior. And that happens 10 or more times. They miss 10 school days. We need to do an FBA. We need to do a functional behavior assessment to figure out what can we do to change things. And then if the behavior involves weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury, those are the times, according to the law, that an FBA needs to be conducted. And another key point, parent and legal guardian permission is required for an FBA. So if, there could be a situation where your school approaches you and says, hey, we're seeing this problem behavior, we want to do an FBA. That triggers the process for reevaluation. And that's where the timelines based on your state could be a little different. But that triggers a timeline for a full reevaluation to do the functional behavior assessment. We can take data on some frequency, how many times does it happen? How long does it happen for? But what's called function-based data, so that ABC data, we need parent permission to do that, to start it. They don't have an active behavior plan with an FBA completed already, because once that's done and they have a behavior plan, there's permission to collect data because the permission was given in order to do all that. So if you request the FBA, which often happens, you've had to pick your kid up a couple times, or you're just concerned, you're hearing reports about this and that, this problem behavior is going on, send an email and just say, I'm writing to request a functional behavior assessment. And then once you make that request, they need to respond to you. Again, the timeline can differ based on state, but they need to respond to you with a yes or a no. And if there's a no, that they need a good reason. And then again, that triggers, they should send a permission form, do the evaluation process, and have a meeting. So this is that link that I mentioned that if you click on it, it has all of the states. You can scroll through and find your state, and you can find what your timelines are. So the bottom line here is that the law does protect, you and your child as far as when an FBA needs to be completed. So, when to get an FBA, but who should conduct the FBA? And that is a really good question. And here, the law is very vague. So legally speaking, the wording in the law just says that an IEP, just needs to be a team member who has training, but it is not specified type of training, extensive training, who that person is, what that title is. So legally speaking, in the school system, according to IDEA, a special ed teacher, a teacher can conduct an FBA, a school psychologist, behavior specialist. So there's a difference between behavior specialist and board certified behavior analyst. Even if someone says they're a behavior analyst, but they're not a board certified behavior analyst. So some school districts will hire, behavior specialists, which just doesn't let you know what their training is or where their background is. There's there might be some state guidelines, and this changes as well. Every state's different. The states themselves, you may have a state that requires a board certified behavior analyst to do it. I don't know every state's rules. But federally speaking, it's just anyone who has training. And so a behavior specialist who could very well be very good and do an excellent FBA because they have really good training, right? I mean, that can happen. You don't have to be a BCBA for it to be amazing. It's possible, but the bottom line is that behavior specialist title doesn't let you know, or doesn't let anyone know what their training is, where they got training, what their background is, any of that. Board certified behavior analyst, or the BCBA, that means that that person has a master's degree in a related field, that they've taken a certain number of graduate level courses in behavior analysis, that they've received lots and lots and lots of observation, and then took a test and passed that test in order to get the BCBA. And then to maintain the BCBA, we have credits, continuing education credits that we need to fulfill a certain number every 2 years. And within that, there's actually specific credits on ethics, which is very nice. So we have to get lots of training on ethics and doing all of this in the best interest of everyone. So it's a best case scenario if you can get a board certified behavior analyst to do the functional behavior assessment, but federal law doesn't require it. So here is the process. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to obtain parental or legal guardian permission. So the permission needs to happen first. The school sends a permission to reevaluate. They write on the permission to reevaluate what they're going to do, and then you say yes or no. And then once they receive that, there's a timeline that they need to follow. And again, that could vary. It will vary by state. The timeline of the process will vary a bit. But you have that. So once you've got permission, then the school staff should reach out, and whoever's doing the FBA should interview. They should talk to relevant school staff. They should, talk to family members. The family members' input is very important. They should be gaining information on, what the problem behaviors are, how they interfere, frequently, and again, this is an interview. So just how frequently do you think they happen? Every day, week, month, more than once a day? How dangerous are they? To get an idea of how to structure the FBA. To the teacher may say, oh, this student is, great during art class, but in gym class, we really see a lot of refusal, and they just plop themselves down and they don't move for 45 minutes. But it doesn't happen in art. So that would let me know, one, I do want to observe the student in art, because what's happening in art, what is it about art that this student is engaging in appropriate behavior, and then what's happening in gym so they're not. So it helps structure where the observations are going to go and the data we're going to talk about, the data we're going to take, how we're going to take it. So there's an interview, and then we're going to define the behavior, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more specifically. So the behaviors need to be defined very clearly, and then there should be an observation. Directly observe the behaviors and collect data. So the individual who's doing the FBA should be directly observing your child or the student who is the subject of the FBA. Once the data is collected, we will analyze it, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Then this is like the meat and potatoes. After we do all this, we formulate a hypothesis statement. So this is what gives us the information, analyze the data, why, under what conditions, and for what reason is this person engaging in this behavior? Because from these hypothesis statements, we then go and make recommendations. So we're going to talk a little bit further about each of these. We're going to start with define. So defining the problem behavior. As we talked about earlier, the behavior needs to be observable and measurable. We need to be able to see it, we need to be able to count it, or hear it, or something like that. We can't just try to do a little mind reading. So non-compliance, typical thing I hear a lot when I go in, the student doesn't listen, they're non-compliant. So I'll say, tell me more about that. What does that look like? And they'll say, well, not following a direction. Well, is that definition, if I define non-compliance as not following a direction, what am I seeing? What is the student doing? Like, how do I measure that? How do I know when it stops? What does that look like? So I would say that this is not a great definition of non-compliance. So what happens is I will go further, and if somebody gives me that answer, I'll say, well, what do you mean not following a direction? What is the person doing? What do I see? What do you see them doing that tells you they're not following a direction? So a better definition might be, when presented with a directive, engages in a vocal or motor behavior other than the requested one, or remains still. So rather than saying ignoring or not responding, when they're ignoring or not responding, what are they doing? They're remaining still. I might say, hey, come on over here. They don't say no, they don't have any up, they just don't move. So they've remained still. So that would be, a good definition of non-compliance. So you want to make sure when you're, reading through the functional behavior assessment that the behaviors are really defined clearly. We're going to do one more. So another one that is pretty common would be the tantrum. So the child tantrums. Okay, so what do they do when they tantrum? Well, they're angry, they're yelling, and they're dysregulated. Well, again, but what dysregulated is really an assumption of some sort of internal state that I can't prove. So while I'm not denying that when individuals are engaging in problem behavior, there's a whole host of emotions going on inside that person, because there's a whole host of emotions. I can't see them, and I can't, unless somebody can explain it to you, and even the verbal report isn't always super reliable. I can't see it, I can't measure it, I can't change it, I can't guarantee it, right? So, all right, they're angry. Yelling, I can see. If we want to get really specific, we could measure some decibels, but that's really a little bit more clinical than what we're going to do in a classroom. Dysregulated. So again, tell me, what do you mean by angry? How do you know? What do you mean by dysregulated? What do you see them doing? So what ends up happening is there's often a whole host of behaviors that show up when we start talking about a tantrum. So for this instance, some common ones we'll see would be elopement, which is leaving the designated area without permission or any attempt to do so. It's important to have that attempt component there, because in a skilled classroom, it very well could be that students are attempting to elope. So sitting at a desk, supposed to be doing work, or they're supposed to stay in this certain classroom. The student gets up and attempts to elope. They stand up from their chair and they take a step, and then there's a staff member who's able to easily redirect them to sit back down. Well, it's really important to know that even though they didn't get out of the classroom or they didn't get far from their desk, that they tried, because we don't even want them trying. We want the student to be happy. We want them to be engaged. We want them to be, you know, working at their desk or doing whatever it is in the classroom without continually trying to leave. Because if you're just continually redirecting them back, that's also going to interfere with learning. And we don't want school to not be fun. We want school to be fun. So I want to make sure that when the student's engaging in things, they're not frequently trying to leave. You know, another thing, maybe when when a teacher told me, oh, dysregulated, they saw this person doing what could be couched as physical disruption. So hurling items in the air, so basically throwing, pushing items off the surface, pushing or turning over furniture. That's really specific, you know. Anybody could walk in and say, yep, that was property disruption, or that's not. And we could count if we wanted how many times they threw, how many times they pushed. We could mark, you know, every interval if they did it or not. Lots of different ways to measure that. But it's going to be clear to see that behavior. Yelling would be using a voice volume that's louder than conversational for the situation. And again, it seems kind of silly to define some of these things because like yelling is a pretty common term. Pretty much anyone can say that person's yelling. But say, like we said here, louder than conversational for the situation. Say they're in gym class and everyone's yelling because they're cheering on their team. Well, I wouldn't record that if I were taking my ABC data for an individual who was yelling, because that was appropriate for that situation. They all should be yelling. But if they're giving me an answer, I say, what's 1 + 1? And they're like, 2, and they say it really loud, which can be disruptive. Well, that would be yelling because that was louder than conversational, and I'm going to record that. It's important for people to realize that yelling can occur, doesn't necessarily have to include bad words or mean things. It's literally just being really loud when you shouldn't be. And then dropping, another one, you know, that is pretty common. So again, it seems kind of silly. We're going to define this, but define it as moving the body from a standing position or a seated position in a chair so that at least the buttocks makes contact with the floor when the student should be standing on their feet or sitting in a chair. Again, if the whole class is doing an in-class project and they're all sitting on the rug area looking at the board, that's not going to be dropping because that is what they're supposed to be doing. But if they're sitting and everyone's standing looking at the board and they're doing, you know, like a go noodle or some sort of activity where they're supposed to be standing and then they sit, well, that would be recorded because that's when they're supposed to be standing. So these definitions help. And often, you know, what happens is, at least I find in what I'm doing, when I do the assessment, I like to pull each behavior out. So when I measure them, I wouldn't measure a tantrum. I would record elopement, property disruption, yelling, and dropping separately. Because what often happens is you see them occur in a chain, and one is a precursor for another. And that's really, really important to know because, for example, if elopement happens and then once they get to the spot, they start disrupting and dropping, if we can interfere and stop the elopement, the rest of the behavior will stop happening because they're all chained together. So that's really important. But if I lumped them all together as happening at the same time, it wouldn't give me as much information. And just remember that, as you can tell, we're going to not include any statements of emotion. So that angrily yelling is not in there anymore. It's just yelling, talking loudly. All right, so now we've defined it, right? So I go in, I talk to the staff, I talk to the family, I define our behaviors, we're all on the same page. Now I need to go in and directly observe these behaviors that we've just defined. So what does that look like? So there could be, actually, I'm going to pull this up later. So when we're looking at data collection, you want the data collection to occur by directly observing the student. Not at the end of the day, not a rating scale. You know, they send home an interview to you and they interview the teacher and the teacher says, oh, every time I say this, this happens. That's fine for an interview. That's very important information, but observing the behavior, because you need to observe the environment, because oftentimes there's variables that, when somebody's in the moment and they're working with a kid, you just can't pay attention to everything. So as an outside observer, that outside observer has the ability to look at all of the variables. So there's some schools, and again, the law doesn't specify that, how particular this needs to be done. So some school districts in some places have adopted like a tiered system where they've decided, well, if the behavior is not super dangerous or really disruptive, we're going to do, I've heard it called like a indirect FBA or a low level FBA, which doesn't involve actually observing the student. It's just all interview and talking and some rating scales. And in my experience, when that's happened, pretty much the interventions aren't successful. And then a full FBA, what they would consider like a level 2 or an intensive FBA, which just means actual observation, is needed because things were missed because they didn't actually observe the student. They just kind of assumed some things. So the data collection, needs to happen. Now, the staff members in the classroom can take some data because the observer, it's possible, there's times where I go in and I just can't catch it. I'm there for an hour, I'm there for 2 hours. I go a couple of times. It's preferable for the data collection to occur across a variety of settings that the student goes in places where the student engages in the problem behavior and doesn't, and with a variety of people to really get an idea, to look for trends. And sometimes, based on the schedule, I go in a couple times and I change it up. It just doesn't happen. But the teachers are reporting it's happening, and I believe them. I believe it's happening. It's just for whatever reason not happening. Sometimes my presence can change it as well. I walk in and they see me, and all of a sudden, oh, okay, I'm going to listen now. So staff can take some direct data as well. They can use these ABC sheets, and you can do a little bit of both. Some with the staff that work and the actual assessor who's doing it. So what data collection, and there's a variety of different ways to collect data. What I'm going to show you isn't like the only way. It's a pretty common way. It's a pretty reliable way. And in addition, you could take frequency or duration, but it's not going to give you function. So we want this function-based data. So this is where the ABCs come in. So this would be a blank paper that people would fill in when they see the defined problem behavior. So those behaviors that I defined earlier, we're going to use as we go through this process. So that noncompliance definition is the same one that I showed you earlier. So this was a blank piece of paper. And so at 11:13 at 9:05 in the classroom, the student was directed to turn off the computer and noncompliance was observed. And then as a consequence, the teacher said, okay, you can have 5 more minutes. And then it was noted that the noncompliance stopped. And then the 5 minutes goes by. So you can see again at 11:13 at 9:10, time is important because there are situations where for whatever reason, a behavior is more likely to occur at a certain time. And so if we know that, we can make alterations to the activities during that time to possibly prevent the problem behavior or certain skills that the individual needs to learn, at that time. Maybe we realize it's happening at a certain time because they need to eat. So then we teach that individual to appropriately ask, well, not in Prader-Willi syndrome world, say they need the nap. And so we've realized it's always happening at a certain time because they need a 30-minute nap. So we teach that individual to ask for a nap at that time, and then we don't have the problem behavior anymore. So time's important. So 5 minutes later, 9:10, turn the computer off again, non-compliance. So this time, stick to their guns, and they just give the direction. I said, turn the computer off. But the student continued playing with the computer. So then these 3 all kind of happen in a row. You can see they're all at 9:10. So then coming back from up here in the consequence section, we're going to drive back down. Direction was repeated. Now the student starts yelling in addition to the noncompliance. And then they start tossing things, toss the table over, and they elope. They run away. And then seamlessly, the yelling and the compliance turned into disruption and elopement. Ultimately, the student got access to another computer. So as they ran around the room, they saw an empty computer and they started playing on it, and then the problem behavior stopped. So that's what an ABC data sheet would look like. And you want to get a couple, sessions worth of data because we're going to look for trends in order to figure out what to do. So this is just a short sample. You would have more than 4. You should have more than 4 entries. So now we have a couple days worth. Say I have 4 or 5 of those sheets filled out, right? Now I need to analyze it. What do I do with this information? So all behavior has a reason. So I'm going to analyze this data to look for trends to figure out why. So behavior is motivated often by access to something. So socially motivated. So they have to go through another person to get attention or to get an item. And that will happen most often. Often you see that when we look at our ABC data. The antecedent condition is possibly that they were just alone, they're doing independent work. Maybe they're in a large group, but not given direct instruction. And when somebody comes over, even if they just come over to say, hey, stop, get back to your work, the behavior stops, right? No attention, they get attention, it stops. It's also important to differentiate the type of attention that the individual is looking for. When we talk about Prader-Willi syndrome, I know a lot of individuals they're very savvy. They're good at negotiating. They're good at arguing, right? Which comes down to it's attention. We're going back and forth. If an individual is engaging in arguing because they're reinforced by the back and forth of the arguing, it's not that, then we need to find a way to match that. Just because we say, oh, they're arguing to get attention, so we're going to replace that by giving them praise every 2 or 3 minutes, that may not work because that's not the type of attention they're looking for. And so you have to look really closely at that. And, often this behavior will occur if they don't have what they want, especially, in our case, if they don't have the food they want. Oops. And then it could be, the other motivator is escape, which would be socially motivated negative reinforcements. They've got to go through someone for something to stop. So typically this happens when a demand is presented and then you remove the demand, or they elope and then they're fine because the demand's been removed. So that's how we know it's for attention. And then automatic reinforcement or sensory stimulation. I think it's best to kind of use this as we've ruled everything else out. Some people jump right to, oh, it's for sensory reasons. It's for sensory reasons. And they jump right to it. But when you look a little bit closer, that may be a little component, but you start to find out, well, it's actually only happening when they're, when they're told to do something or when a toy is taken away from them. And so there could be another function for it. But automatic reinforcement just means, the person, they just do it because they like doing it and they don't need anyone else to get it. They can do it themselves. And the hallmark of this, if the function really is automatic, is that it can be hard to predict. It happens across a variety of settings, across a variety of people, multiple conditions. That's definitely a hallmark of behavior that is for automatic reinforcement. So now I say we've got to analyze this data, right? We want numbers. Behavior analysts like numbers. We like graphs. If you have a functional behavior analysis with functional behavior assessment, doesn't have graphs, it doesn't have numbers, then something needs to change. So what we do is, what we're looking at here is what's called the antecedent analysis, that antecedent condition. So we've taken our couple pages of entries from, I showed you a couple slides back of the ABC data. So what you can see here is we've got a graph that goes from 0, a bar graph, and goes up to 1. The closer to 1, so the longer the graph is, the more likely that behavior is going to occur when under that condition. So if we look at elopement and physical disruption, you can see that brown bar goes all the way up to 1. That's like a really strong relationship. They're most likely to occur after yelling and noncompliance has occurred. So that's really important to know. If we can get an intervention for yelling and noncompliance, we can possibly stop the elopement and physical disruption. So that's really, really good to know. You can see noncompliance and yelling. The yellow bar is pretty high. It's almost 0.75, 0.72. When they're told to stop a reward, to hand over a reinforcing item, you're going to see that problem behavior. And then the consequence analysis, you can see, again, physical disruption and dropping. So when they engaged in that, typically whoever they were with continued to talk to them and they explained things to them. We can't do this. You're going to break things. I'm going to be sad. All of that. But it just kept the behavior going. Yelling, non-compliance, you can see those yellow bars are pretty high, close to 1. So after they engaged in those behaviors, they got access to something. Elopement was kind of even, but again, access was pretty strong. So this gives us some information on how to write the hypothesis statements and what to do about it. So we've analyzed the data. So now we're going to formulate a hypothesis statement. So a hypothesis statement typically occurs, it looks like this. We're going to isolate the condition, we isolate the behavior, and then we isolate the function. And it is very possible and not uncommon for a single behavior to have a different function under different conditions, which is why it was important when I said I separate out those tantrum behaviors, because the function is going to drive the intervention. And you also, well, here, I'm going to show you a few. So based on the data, so we defined the behaviors, then we analyzed it. So based on that analyzing, these are some hypothesis statements that could be made. So when asked to stop a reinforcing activity, Max may engage in non-compliance and yelling in order to maintain access to that activity. So that's that socially mediated, positive reinforcement. He wants something. He's going to say no, and he's going to yell because he wants it. And then when he's engaging in yelling and non-compliance, Max may engage in physical disruption and elopement in order to gain or maintain access to that item, activity, or attention. And then the third statement would be when engaging in elopement and access to the reinforcing item activity is restricted. So this is where it's important to look at conditions. So we've already said no, we've already said you can't have it, and he runs away. Then he's going to drop in order to gain or maintain access to that item. So we can see here, Max is engaging in problem behavior to get something, and the behaviors may look different under different conditions. And this is going to be helpful because after we formulate that, we need to make recommendations. So I'm not going to go into a long, lengthy, I just told Stacy, I'm not going to go into a long, lengthy thing about what those specific recommendations would be, because that's a whole other can of worms. But generally speaking, when we're looking at our recommendations, and again, this also is in the law, your interventions and the recommendations should be based in positive reinforcement. IDEA says that all interventions should be based in positive reinforcement. So that means reinforcement means the goal is to increase the behavior. I'm actively working to increase something. Now, going in tandem, if I'm increasing something, that bad thing's going to go away, that inappropriate behavior I don't want anymore. As the good thing goes up, the other one's going to go down. But my focus is not on decreasing. My focus is on increasing. So for example, the non-compliance, we want someone to work longer. So I'm going to look at focusing on cooperative behavior. I want to increase the number of responses that individual can engage in. So initially I may say 2 responses, an average of 2 responses, and we get reinforcement. And when we don't have any problem behavior like that, we're going to go up to 3. So now they're responding longer and longer. And inadvertently, we're not getting a lot of non-compliance, but my focus is on positive reinforcement. And just as a side note, positive means we're adding something to the environment, we're giving them a token, we're giving them praise, we're giving them high five, we're giving them a toy, we're giving them the iPad, the behavior goes up. Negative reinforcement still means we're increasing behavior, but it means we're taking something away. So that's that idea of escape. So I say, do your work, they do their work, I remove the work. They're really reinforced by the work being removed, not punishment. Negative reinforcement in the ABA terms does not equal punishment. It just means I've removed something to increase the behavior. So you want to make sure it's based on positive reinforcement, and things like timeout, that's technically a punishment procedure because you're adding something to decrease the behavior. Only under extreme circumstances, when there's really, really strong data to support that all possible positive reinforcement strategies have been have been tried. Could a team consider talking about some sort of punishment procedure? And that would be because this problem behavior, like, children who bang their heads thousands of times a day, a child who might run in the middle of the street, like the behavior they're doing is so dangerous and they're not responding to positive reinforcement. But the punishment, the negative stuff should never be the first line of defense. And if this is a first time FBA, unless the behavior is so severe, all the recommendations should be positive reinforcement based. The recommendation should be based on the hypothesis statements. So in our example, our individual wanted things. He engaged in problem behavior because he wanted things. So my interventions are going to be based on teaching him to get things without having problem behavior. I'm not going to work on other things. This one's really important. I want you to consider skill deficits. So especially when we're looking at a behavior that's maintained by escape. So oftentimes come up with a statement that says, the child is, hits the teacher because they don't want to do, they want the work, they want to escape the work. So my solution is to give them a break card. And when I show them the work, they can ask for a break. But let's look a little closer. What is it about the work? Why do they want to escape the work? What can I change in that antecedent condition so that the student is cooperative, so that I can provide positive reinforcement? It's highly likely that yes, they are motivated to escape the work. That's true, but it's because the work's too hard, it's too easy, the reinforcement rate's too low. Any one of those things, there's a skill that the student needs to do. So for example, we said in our example that when Max has to stop something he likes, so he has to give up the computer, he'll engage in problem behavior to get the computer back. So separating or transitioning from something preferred to non-preferred is difficult for him. Giving up reinforcement is difficult. So let's teach him, rather than saying, oh, we'll limit time on the computer. Every time he has a computer, he has problem behavior. So if we just limit the computer, it's fine. He won't have problem behavior. But it hasn't taught him anything. There's going to be plenty of times in his life where he has to tolerate, he has to give up, he has to accept no. So let's teach him that. There's really systematic ways to do that. But let's consider that skill deficit. Let's not just give him a break card. Maybe that's appropriate. And in situations, maybe where the individual's a lot older or the problem behavior is pretty severe, like they're going to poke their eye real bad. All right, let's do the break card situation because I don't want there to be any chance of them poking their eye and causing injury. But when they're reliably handing a break card without problem behavior, now let's give it a little bit of delay. So they hand you the break card, you say 1 second, and then until eventually they're handing you the break card and you can say, okay, you can have 20 minutes, you'll have your break. So they do learn to cooperate because it's going to have to happen at some point. And then always consider the motivating operations. And again, thinking about Prader-Willi syndrome, you better make sure that as part of the FBA, they're assessing the food situation. Assess the food situation. Does the teacher, they always have an issue in art class, but they love art. They come home, they do art on YouTube, they do an online art class with their other little friends, but art class, the student's refusing to go to art class, I can't figure it out. Well, maybe that teacher's got a bowl of mints on the desk. Maybe she's got a jar of Jolly Ranchers in the back. Maybe it's right after lunch and it smells like the cafeteria. Those things are going to make it more likely for an antecedent to create a problem behavior. So consider those. Has that teacher or anyone in that room, has a kid in that room at some point, given that person, they shared their food at lunch one day when they shouldn't have? Is there a history, something? So you've got to consider food security when you're looking at the functional behavior assessment and the environment and the history there. And all those other things, consider motivating operations. You also want to consider, which would fit in here, the medical piece. That's pretty big. I know our guys don't always, spike a fever when they're sick and they have strep throat. They have the gallstone, but they don't have any pain till it's the last minute. So there could very well be some underlying medical causes going on. So you want to look at that too. If it's a sudden change, if your child has never engaged in this behavior before, and all of a sudden school's reporting it and you're seeing it at home, that's what I would do first before for, you may ask for an FBA because that takes some time to get rolling, but rule out any medical situation that could be going on. Get in there. My favorite line, I just say, go in and I want you to check every hole because you might find something somewhere that, the child can't tell me about. And oftentimes there's some sort of something going on in the eye or something on the skin that's bothering him that we don't know. So those motivating operations are going to be really important. So your final product, so whatever your timeline is, it gets done. You have the IEP team members, including the family, will get a report, and it'll include all the information because there could be other stuff. If you do a full reevaluation, in addition to the FBA, there, speech could do testing. It opens up the door for lots of other things to happen. But you should get that full report, and you should get it before the meeting so you can read it and review it. Then, the meeting's held. You discuss the results, answer your questions. Maybe you have to make changes to the IEP. Maybe you add a positive behavior support plan. Maybe they had a positive behavior support plan. So for example, there could be an instance where a student had an FBA done in kindergarten, part of preschool transition. Now they're in 6th grade and their behavior looks different. Like now they're using some choice words they weren't using in kindergarten. And that is not included in the initial FBA. So even though they have a behavior plan, an FBA was done, it wasn't done on this cursing behavior, you might do a new FBA, which would then change the current behavior plan and add in that. So it could result in a formal behavior plan. It could result in just a couple SDIs in the IEP. So it's a specially designed instruction. So not a full behavior plan, but just a few tweaks if what you find, if the results say that. And that, yeah, so that's what your final plan should look like. So I think we're good. We're right on, pretty much on that hour mark. Paige, do you want me to keep sharing or?
Yeah, I think we are right just about at time, and we have a couple of questions, Cindy, if you're
Yep.
up for those. Okay.
Yep.
The first question, do schools have to do I think you answered this, but do they have to do an FBA if the parent asks? This person had asked and was told 4 was too early.
Oh, so that reason is not a valid reason. The short answer is no, they're not required to do the FBA if you ask. They're required to respond with a certain period of time. So Pennsylvania requires 10 days. So you send an email, I want an FBA, they have 10 days to tell me yes or no. And if they say yes, they should be sending out that permission. But 4 is not too young. So I would ask again and be really specific in I'm not sure how they requested the FBA, but I would just, if you really feel like that's what your child needs and you can really be specific about the behaviors that are occurring and the effect it's having either on the individual's learning, the other individuals, the safety, whatever, be real specific about that and just ask again.
Perfect. And then anonymous, as someone who reviews data collection records, I find it really useful and more expedient to include the day of the week, so I don't have to go to a calendar to identify the day, specific class, adults present, etc. This helps to see patterns related to these 3 variables in addition to time. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the more the better. My sheets, the sheet that I showed you was similar to what I have classroom staff instructional assistants fill out, and sometimes having them put in so much information, I don't get all of it. But yeah, I mean, the more, my observations have a little bit more detailed information. So yes, I'll have the person. But yeah, I mean, the more information, the better for sure.
Great. And this next suggestion is good. People with PWS have definite opinions on the people around them and how the adults interact with them. Makes a huge difference. Perhaps the teacher or parent needs training on PWS and how that child works best. Sometimes the adults inadvertently trigger a problem behavior.
Yeah. Yep. And that would probably be, yes. Yeah. And that could come out of, the ABC data. You might see, like the last person said, they write down who the person is. And you might see it always happens again at this certain time or with this certain person with this activity. And by seeing their response, that would then trigger. So that could be a really good recommendation. Like I said, I can't go into all the recommendations, but specific training about Prader-Willi syndrome, if they've never had it, or if what was observed and how they're currently responding, that could be a recommendation for sure.
Great. That's all the questions. Does anybody else have a question right now for Cindy? If not, Cindy, thank you so much. I know we could listen to you for ever and probably have a lot of questions. You have a lot of great experience. So thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. We really, really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's fun.
Yeah. And to everybody that's still here, again, I know there are some people that have been with us all day. So thanks for attending these sessions. And we've had lots of people ask if we're going to offer more and more in depth. And we do plan to offer more down the road. So stay tuned. And again, you have everybody's contact, but all of this will be coming out. But if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to PWSA, info@pwsausa.org. And we're here. We're happy to help you. As Stacy mentioned before, we do have 24-hour support. So we have a 24-hour, online person on call. So if you need something, give us a call. And I'm going to let everybody go. I know it's dinner time for many people, but Stacy, Stacy's still here with us too. So Stacy, thanks for being in the background doing your technical work. And Cindy, thank you again, and have a great evening, everybody.